Hi, in this video we're going to be discussing Dawn's target range settings. These are the settings that determine whether Dawn suggests a dose change, how big that dose change is, and how long a next test interval Dawn recommends. Now, when deciding whether to recommend a dose change, Dawn isn't only interested in whether the current result is within or outside the therapeutic target range. It also wants to know how far from the target INR the current result is, but also how frequently other similar results have been occurring. And what it's doing is applying statistical process control techniques. So imagine a frequency diagram where we list a whole range of possible values and then we chart how often each occurs. If those follow a normal distribution, we would expect to end up with a bell curve where the greatest frequency of results happen somewhere around the mean. Now, this is what we would expect to see if we charted a whole load of INR results as a bar chart. We would see something like this that follows a normal distribution. If this is the 2 to 3 range, we would expect the largest number of results to be clustered around the mean, or the target of 2.5. But when we're interested in the probability of a particular result occurring, we're not only interested in the mean, we're also interested in the standard deviation, which is a measure of the spread of results. Now, statistically, we would expect about 68% of results to occur within one standard deviation from the mean. And we would expect about 95% of results to occur within 2 standard deviations from the mean. So how does all this map onto our settings in Dawn, and how does it determine when Dawn will or won't suggest the dose change? Now, the standard deviation for INRs tends to be about 0.8. So given a range of 2 to 3, that would give us one standard deviation at about 1.7 and another at about 3.3. That means that 68% of INRs you would expect to fall within this band, with the greatest concentration around the mean of 2.5. So for a normal well-controlled patient, most of their results are going to fall here, but a one-off that's low but still above 1.7, or is high but still below 3.3, might purely just be down to chance. And in that case, it's just as likely the next INR result will be right in range again. However, if a result falls outside of these standard deviation limits, it's much more likely to be significant. So what we do in Dawn is say a result in this band or results in this band outside of those standard deviations, we will dose change straight away. So 1 out of 1 results that are below 1.8 or above 3.3, we're going to dose change straight away. If a result is low, however, but it's above that standard deviation lower limit, that 1.7, 1.8, so it's in this band here, that could just be down to chance. So what we need to do is say, well, has this happened before? So we look back at the last 2 results, so 3 in all, the current one and the last 2, and we say, were 2 out of those 3 low? If they are, then Dawn will recommend a dose change. If they're not, if it's just one of those is low, the current one, and it's still above this, within this standard deviation from the norm, then we won't dose change straight away. But we have another band here and here. These are based on not the standard deviation for all patients, but the standard deviation for the best controlled patients. This standard deviation is much narrower at 0.3. So really well controlled patients you would expect to fall, or 68% of them to fall within 2.2 to 2.8. So if somebody's dose is right, it's spot on, you would hope they would fall in this band. If they're well controlled and they don't have too many complications, they do take their meds as necessary, but their results are consistently falling just below this line, what that probably suggests is the dose is too low. Or if it falls above this line, the dose is probably slightly too high. So what you're seeing there is that the curve is over here. The mean is slightly lower than it should be, or slightly higher than it should be. Now, they may be getting results well in this band, but they might be the natural variation, whereas in fact the majority are concentrated slightly lower in the range. So what we do is we have this additional 4 out of 5 check, which will dose change if 4 out of 5 have been below this better standard deviation or above this one. Now let's look at the settings in Dawn. To access the target range settings, I choose Lookup Tables from the Management menu, Anticoagulation Tables and Target INR, and then I can select the range I'm interested in. For the purpose of this video, we're just going to look at the 2 to 3 range because it's the best known and the most widely used. All the others follow exactly the same principles. Now I'll come back to what the miscellaneous settings and the result status settings mean in a moment. I want to start by looking at the INR triggers because these map directly onto the dose change decisions that we've just been talking about. I can see them displayed in the tab, but I would have to scroll to access them all. If I just click on one record, they come up in their own dedicated table, so I can see everything at a glance. Let's look at the columns we have in this table. We have a lower limit and an upper limit for the INR. So Dawn will take the current result and find which of these bands it falls into. It will then look at the test count, which is how many tests, including the current one, it should look back at, and the occurs column that says how many times does a result in this band occur in this number of tests. Now, where it finds a match, there's up to 3 different actions it can take. First one is calc prevention. So as we can see here, if the INR is less than 1.3 just once, we're not going to let Dawn suggest a dose. You will have to dose that patient manually. And on the high side, the same applies if the INR is above 5. This -1 here simply means no limit. Here we can see that if the INR is below 1.9, or again if it's above 3.3, we're going to give a low INR or a high INR warning that advises the user to check with the patient. Is there a reason for this? Did the patient forget to take a dose? Did they take the tablet twice? Is that something you might want to consider if Dawn does suggest a dose change? Because perhaps in that circumstance the dose change isn't appropriate. But the third possible action is for Dawn to suggest a dose change. So here we see if the INR is below 2 out of 3 times, it's going to suggest a dose change. And it's going to cap that dose change at 15%. That doesn't mean it will always give a 15% dose change. Dawn will take the last dose and it will adjust it proportionally to how far the current INR is away from the target INR. It's just if the figure it comes up with is more than the 15% dose change, it will then cap that at 15%. But if you remember, we were saying this 2 out of 3 really only applies within the single standard deviation from the mean. So we've got this just being low. And if we look at the equivalent on the high side, which is here, it's if the INR is above 3. So if it's ever high or low, 2 out of 3 times. But if we look here, we'll see there's another dose change trigger, and the equivalent one on the high side is here. So if the INR is above 3.3 just once, Dawn will recommend a dose change, and likewise if it's below 1.8 just once, it will also recommend a dose change. So an INR of 1.7 or an INR of 3.4 is going to produce a dose change straight away. This will only kick in where the current INR is within that single standard deviation from the norm, and then it will require 2 out of 3 to have met this criteria in order to produce a dose change. But obviously, 2 of these could both apply. The current INR might be 1.9, or might be 1.7, and the previous one was 1.9 or something like that. So this would apply, and so would this. So which one does it use? Because they've both got different caps. Well, Dawn will always use the trigger with the smallest maximum percentage dose change. Because what this is saying is it's more likely that the patient's mean is actually slightly lower than where it should be. They've probably got a spread of results that go into range, but they've also getting some low ones, and it needs probably a smaller dose adjustment to correct that than if they have been fine, something's changed, and we're getting a significantly out of range result as a one-off. If you remember, we also had those other standard deviations, the narrower band based on the best INR results, and we have a dose change trigger for this as well. So if the result is below 2.2, or if it's above 2.8, 4 out of 5 times, Dawn will also suggest a dose change, but it will cap that at 10%. So if all 3 apply, we'll go with this one. However, there is a caveat to this, because Dawn will only suggest a dose change if the current INR is out of range. So in this case, if the INR is 2.9 or even 3, Dawn won't suggest a dose change. But we might still want to make it clear to the user that we've identified this trend. So what we do, we configure a warning with exactly the same settings. This will always trigger. This will only trigger if the current INR is out of range. So let's go back to our INR settings, and we'll move next to the interval rules, because these are bound up with the dose change rules. These determine which next test interval Dawn suggests. And again, they have a lower limit and an upper limit for the INR, but here they have a last interval, a normal interval, and a dose change interval. So what we can see is if the INR is below 1.8 and the patient's last interval was greater or equal to 7 days, they will get 7 days, whether it's the normal interval or the dose change interval. Normal interval is if no dose change has been suggested. Dose change interval is if dose change has been suggested. Now here again, we have a number of settings for this band that's kind of within the one standard deviation. So a single INR here may well have just been down to chance. So what Dawn does here is if the patient has had a dose change, it will cut them back to 7 or 14, depending on how long a test interval they're already on. But if they don't have a dose change, so that, 1 out of 1 results above the single standard deviation, so where we would need 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 5 to recommend a dose change, where a dose change doesn't happen or isn't recommended, we just keep them on the same interval. Now, I must say here, that's not what happens in our latest settings. I'm going to come to that in a little bit. These are our older standard settings. This was the way they were set up. I'm showing you these because it may be how your system is set up. So I'll explain what has changed in a moment. But let's carry on looking at these settings as they are. That contrasts with these results, which are for the in-range band. So where they're in range, Dawn looks at what they had last time and increments it. So if they were on 7 last time, they go to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28, 28 to 42. For a lot of you, 42 might be the maximum setting that you have for everybody's treatment plan. So it won't actually go beyond that. If the patient's maximum interval is 42, that's the most Dawn will suggest. If you allow up to 84, you will move up this table. But as we get nearer the top, I'm just going to pull this up a bit so you can see it properly. You can see to get to the biggest intervals, to get to 84, and we're going up in bigger leaps here because the patient is clearly very stable. We're going up in 2 weeks at a time rather than 1 week at a time. But other criteria must apply. You have a choice in how you configure this. You can say how many consecutive INRs in range, or you can say how many consecutive no dose changes. And that's what we've used here. So to get from 70 days to 84, there must be 5 consecutive no dose changes. From 56 to 70, there must be at least 3 consecutive no dose changes. And if we look back, you might have noticed I skipped over a record down here. But if the patient's last interval was 7 days, but they've had 4 consecutive no dose changes, that 7 days might not have been to do with instability. It might have just been practically that they're going to be away the following week, or they're going away on holiday and had their INR done early. Their stability and the fact they're in range this time means we can bump them up to 21 straight away, which just saves them having to start again climbing this ladder. But as I said before, the interval that the patient is currently on must be greater than or equal to the last interval shown here. So where we have several rules for an INR band, and we have several last intervals shown, if the patient's say on 28, all of these are going to apply. So which one does it go with? Well, it will read off whether it's the dose change or normal interval, and then it will take the maximum value permitted in that column. So in this case, if they're currently on 28 weeks, it's going to give them 42, not 21 or 14. Problem interval is pretty much obsolete now. You can mark a patient as a problem patient on their treatment plan, and it would just mean that this interval applies instead of the normal interval. Now we have a max interval that you can apply per patient and you can configure. That's pretty much kind of overridden the need for this. However, I do want to talk a little bit more about these settings, these kind of within the 1 standard deviation settings, where we're keeping the patient on the same interval if they're out of range but no dose change has applied. These were our original standard settings, but a few years ago we revised them. We thought, although scientifically this makes sense, it was it would be good to err on the side of caution and test the patient again sooner, just to check there's no trend or nothing else going on there. So on our latest standard settings, for this sort of within one standard deviation but still out of range, and we have the same on the high side, the normal interval now resembles the dose change interval rather than resembling the last interval. So we cut them back to 7 or 14. I mention that because you may well have the settings that I'm showing you here. If you do, and you would like to tighten them up so that we always cut back if the INR is out of range, even if we don't dose change, let us know. That's something we can install very simply and easily with the script. We'll look next at the miss and boost rules. If an INR has gone high, Dawn does allow you to specify that the patient should take no warfarin for 1 day or 2 days and then resume on the weekly pattern. Likewise, if the INR has dropped low for some reason, you might want to give a booster dose, 10 milligrams, 7 milligrams, whatever's appropriate, for 1 or 2 days. Because booster doses depend so much on what the patient's normal dose is, we can't really configure Dawn to suggest doing that automatically, but we can configure Dawn to suggest when to miss a dose for 1 or 2 days. And we do that on this Miss or Boost Rules tab. The settings are very simple. Here's the dose is 0 for 1 day, take 0 milligrams for 1 day if the INR is greater or equal to 4.3 and less than 4.6. And we'll take 0 milligrams for 2 days if the INR is greater than 4.6. So to summarise, using our standard settings, if a single INR falls outside one standard deviation from the target, Dawn will suggest a dose change straight away. Within one standard deviation from the target, Dawn will require either 2 out of 3 INRs to have been out of range, or 4 out of 5 previous INRs to have been outside a narrower standard deviation based on the results from the best controlled patients. As far as intervals go, if the patient is in range, Dawn will extend their interval. If they're out of range, using our latest settings, it will always cut them back to 7 or 14 days, depending on what their current interval is. On our older standard settings, if they were out of range, it would depend on whether or not they'd had a dose change. If they'd had a dose change, they'd be cut back to 7 or 14 days. If they hadn't had a dose change, they would be kept on the same interval. Please check your interval settings. If you would like to tighten them up to work like our latest standard ones, let us know. That's a very easy change to make.